She walked down the aisle smiling. By nightfall, her lips were blackened, her veins swollen, and her husband was screaming as she died in his arms. No one spoke of it again. This was Hartford, Connecticut, 1841. A town proud of its order, its churches, its reputation as a civilized jewel of the Northeast. But behind the painted shutters and prim gardens was something darker. Something whispered in kitchens and scratched in the pages of a few surviving diaries. The story of the bride who never lived past her wedding night. The story of a mother-in-law whose hatred seemed more ancient than family rivalry, more like ritual than crime. What happened in Hartford was never written into the official record. Newspapers printed polite notices, speaking only of a tragic illness. But letters tell a different story. Town accounts hint at strange church involvement, a burial carried out in the middle of the night, and a family sealed in shame. To this day, there are those who claim the house still stands, boarded and rotting, with a faint smell of bitter almonds that never fades, the scent of poison, the scent of secrets. The bride was named Eleanor Whitcombe. She was 19, with porcelain skin and the kind of innocence that made her a symbol of purity for Hartford's elite families. Her groom, Thomas Ellsworth, came from a line of powerful merchants. Their union was not only a marriage but a consolidation of wealth, influence, and reputation. But at the edge of this picture stood Margaret Ellsworth, Thomas's mother. Widowed, stern, her face carved with the severity of a woman who had survived both famine and fire. Margaret opposed the marriage. Not openly, never openly, but her silence was heavy. She claimed Eleanor carried something unfit for the family. No one knew what she meant. On October 12, 1841, Eleanor walked into the church. The organ roared. Guests filled the pews, dressed in their finest. Candlelight trembled on the stone walls. And yet, several witnesses later wrote the same detail. Margaret Ellsworth never lifted her eyes from the floor. She did not look at her son. She did not look at the bride. When the vows were spoken, Margaret's lips moved, whispering something, prayer, or a curse. The wedding feast was a grand affair. Hartford's wealthiest families gathered in the Whitcombe parlor, a room lined with velvet curtains and heavy oak furniture. Platters of roasted meats, candied fruits, and crystal decanters of imported wine filled the tables. The guests laughed, toasted, and praised the union as a blessing for the town. Yet in every account that survives, there is one repeated image. Margaret Ellsworth standing at the far end of the table, her hands folded, her gaze fixed on her new daughter-in-law. She barely touched her plate. She barely spoke. It was here, among the laughter and the clink of glasses, that the poison was slipped. Some claimed it was in the wine, a faint almond taste that Eleanor dismissed as sweetness. Others swore it was in the sugared almonds themselves, placed delicately in a silver dish. What is certain is that Eleanor began to falter before the evening was done. A flush rose on her skin, her breathing turned ragged, and she leaned heavily against her husband's shoulder. By midnight, the laughter had died. Guests whispered of sudden illness, of fainting spells. But Eleanor's cries soon turned to screams. Thomas carried Eleanor upstairs to her bridal chamber. The guests were ordered to leave, yet many lingered outside, drawn by the sound of her suffering. Witnesses later described a shriek that tore through the night, followed by hours of choking, retching, and gasping. The doctor arrived too late. Eleanor's body was found twisted, her lips darkened, her veins bulging with a sickly blue. Poisoning was obvious to anyone with eyes. Yet the official report was carefully worded. Complications of a sudden and violent fever. Why? Why erase the truth? That question lingers even now. Some point to the Ellsworth family's influence, wealth, and power that could silence both physician and priest. Others whisper of the church's involvement, that the Reverend himself ordered the words struck from the record. And Margaret? She sat at the foot of the bed, calm, composed, whispering hymns as her daughter-in-law's body grew cold. When Thomas demanded answers, she replied only once, "Better she perish than the family be cursed." Eleanor's body was not honored with the ceremony expected of Hartford's elite. Instead, the burial took place in silence, long before dawn. The casket was lowered into the ground with no procession, no choir, and only a handful of witnesses. Neighbors awoke to the sound of shovels and the dim glow of lanterns flickering through the fog. Some said the grave was dug behind the church, unmarked, hidden among the older stones weathered beyond recognition. Others insist she was buried on Ellsworth land itself, beneath the orchard where the soil was always strangely barren. The secrecy was deliberate. It was as though Eleanor had been erased from Hartford entirely, reduced to whispers and rumor. Her name was never spoken in the Ellsworth home again. Yet the silence did not last. Within weeks, townsfolk began to murmur of strange sights. Candlelight flickering in the orchard at midnight, hymns sung in a woman's voice though no one stood there, and the faint, sickly sweet scent of almonds drifting through the autumn air. Something had been buried that did not wish to remain hidden. The Ellsworth home became a place no one wished to enter. Servants whispered of doors opening by themselves, of footsteps echoing in empty rooms. Thomas, shattered by grief, locked himself away. Some nights, neighbors swore they heard him pounding the walls, begging his wife's voice to answer. Margaret, however, moved through the house like a warden. She forbade mourning clothes, silenced prayers, and burned Eleanor's possessions in the hearth. Yet the scent of bitter almonds lingered in the hallways no matter how many windows were opened. The smell was strongest in the bridal chamber, Eleanor's final place of agony. One maid later confessed in a diary that Margaret would spend hours sitting in that room, rocking slowly in a chair, whispering scripture in a language the girl did not recognize. When confronted, Margaret struck her and warned, "What was bound that night must stay bound. If it is unloosed, the curse will spread." The town turned to Reverend Josiah Pritchard, a man known for his booming sermons and iron grip on Hartford's moral life. But when asked to explain Eleanor's death, he gave only evasions. At Sunday service, he urged his congregation to accept the will of Providence and avoid unholy speculation. Why would the church protect Margaret? Letters discovered in the archives decades later suggest a troubling connection. Margaret Ellsworth's dowry had funded much of the church's expansion. New pews, a refurbished altar, even the imported bell that tolled above the town. Some now suspect a darker arrangement. That Margaret had offered more than money. That she had offered silence about something the church itself had hidden. Those who questioned too loudly found themselves ostracized. Business deals collapsed. Children were expelled from church schools. Hartford learned quickly. One does not pry into the Ellsworth curse. Whispers began in the town orphanage, a stone building run under the same church. Children spoke of a woman in a wedding gown drifting through the halls at night, her hands outstretched, her mouth opening but never speaking. Some claimed she left behind a trail of dead blossoms, brittle and black. At first, the matrons dismissed the tales. But records show a string of sudden illnesses among the children that winter, symptoms eerily similar to Eleanor's. Convulsions, vomiting, blackened lips. Each case written off as fever, but none survived more than a night. Parents stopped bringing orphans to the institution. Hartford streets filled with ragged, starving children. Yet the church refused to acknowledge the problem, calling it God's testing. The question remained unspoken but sharp. Was Eleanor's curse spreading? Thomas Ellsworth did not recover. He was seen wandering the orchard at night, whispering his wife's name, digging at the soil with his bare hands. Neighbors found him on his knees, holding handfuls of dirt, begging Eleanor to return. When he spoke to others, his words grew disjointed. He spoke of her voice calling from beneath the earth. He swore he saw her face in the window at twilight. Once, he claimed his mother had bound Eleanor to the family with poison, to guard a secret older than Hartford itself. By spring, Thomas was committed to the asylum on the outskirts of town. The institution described his condition as violent melancholia. Visitors were forbidden. His mother signed the papers herself. What Thomas knew, what he had seen, was buried with him inside those padded walls. As months passed, Hartford wrapped the tragedy in silence. Families spoke of it only in whispers, and only when certain no Ellsworth servant could overhear. The official records were carefully adjusted. Eleanor's name erased from church rosters, her grave unmarked, her wedding barely mentioned in town logs. But memory cannot be so easily scrubbed. Travelers passing through described Hartford as a place where eyes followed you too long, where townsfolk seemed haunted by something they could not confess. The orchards never grew again. Crops failed in strange patches of land. Livestock grew sick without reason. And still, the Reverend thundered from the pulpit that faith requires forgetting. Hartford obeyed. But the silence became its own curse, a wound stitched shut with lies, festering beneath the surface. The Hartford Asylum was a place meant to be unseen, built on a bleak hill outside town where the fog clung like a shroud. Patients were locked in cold stone cells, their screams carried down the corridors like wind through hollow pipes. It was here that Thomas Ellsworth was confined. Records from attendants describe his obsession with the orchard, his muttering about roots that bind her soul. They note his fear of his mother, calling her the keeper of the key. He scratched symbols into the walls, circles intersected with crosses, spirals leading inward. The staff scrubbed them away, but Thomas drew them again and again, often with his own blood. One letter, smuggled out by a sympathetic nurse, speaks of a night when Thomas claimed Eleanor appeared in his cell, her mouth sewn shut, her eyes weeping black tears. He begged the nurse to unearth her before the curse rots the town. Days later, the nurse vanished without a trace. While her son wasted in confinement, Margaret Ellsworth grew only more powerful. She hosted gatherings of Hartford's wealthiest families, meetings that stretched past midnight. From the outside, they resembled social dinners. But neighbors swore they heard chanting, low and guttural, carried on the night air. A diary belonging to a visiting merchant described the experience in disturbing terms. He wrote of being served wine laced with herbs, of seeing symbols carved into the dining table, of Margaret leading a prayer not in English but in some older tongue. The entry ends abruptly with the words, "She spoke of binding bloodlines, of sacrifice to preserve the city's favor." Within weeks, the merchant's ship sank in the Atlantic. The diary washed ashore in fragments, waterlogged but legible. His family refused to claim it. By 1843, Hartford's church faced whispers of scandal. The deaths in the orphanage, the failed crops, the strange gatherings at the Ellsworth estate. It was too much to ignore. Parishioners began to question Reverend Pritchard. Some demanded answers. But instead of addressing the rumors, the Reverend tightened his control. He preached fire and brimstone, declaring Hartford chosen, but tested. He warned that questioning authority was the devil's work. And yet, private letters found decades later suggest something darker. The Reverend himself was entangled in Margaret's designs. One letter, and signed but preserved in the Yale archives, describes a pact, land grants to the church, protection of its power, in exchange for silence about Eleanor's death. The letter ends with a chilling line, "The mother binds, the church preserves, the town survives." The orchard where Eleanor was said to be buried became a place of fear. Children dared each other to run through it at night, but few returned without scratches, bruises, or worse. Farmers claimed their animals refused to graze near the land. In 1845, 2 boys disappeared while playing near the orchard. Their bodies were found days later, buried shallowly among the roots, their mouths blackened, their throats raw. The official explanation: they had eaten poisonous berries. Yet the townsfolk recognized the signs. Eleanor's curse had struck again. That night, locals claimed they saw lanterns moving among the trees, Margaret at the center, her white hair gleaming like bone in the moonlight. The orchard was fenced off soon after, labeled private property, forbidden to all. Still, the almond scent lingered. By the late 1840s, Hartford was unraveling. Families fled. Businesses collapsed. The orphanage shuttered its doors. Crops failed year after year. And yet, the Ellsworth estate remained untouched. Its wealth intact, its matriarch untouchable. Thomas Ellsworth died in the asylum in 1849. His death marked simply as failure of the heart. But among his belongings was found a final scrawl. Not death, but binding. She is beneath us still. The Reverend continued to preach until his sudden collapse in the pulpit. Witnesses say he clawed at his throat, gasping, as though some invisible hand had closed around him. His last words were garbled, but one phrase was clear enough to chill the congregation. "The bride is awake." Hartford never recovered. The town shrank, its history rewritten, its archives purged. But the story lived on in fragments. Diaries, rumors, the faint traces of truth that could never quite be buried. In 1852, a traveler passing through Hartford lodged at a small boarding house near the abandoned orchard. The keeper, an elderly woman who had once worked as a maid for the Ellsworth family, left behind a chilling confession in her personal journal. She wrote of nights when Margaret forced the servants into the cellar, where salt circles and symbols marked the floor. She described Eleanor's death not as murder, but as ritual sealing. The poison, she claimed, was not meant to kill outright but to bind Eleanor's spirit to the Ellsworth bloodline. Her words were clear. The bride was never meant to rest. She was meant to watch, to guard, to suffer beneath us. The boarding house burned to the ground that winter. The journal was recovered from the ashes, half-charred but still legible. The woman was never seen again. By the 1860s, Hartford's youth began telling ghost stories about the orchard. Children claimed they saw a pale bride between the trees, her veil trailing in the dirt, her face shadowed. Some swore she beckoned them closer, others that she screamed without sound. Adults dismissed the tales, but patterns emerged. Several children disappeared over the years, their names erased from church records as though they had never lived. No one dared accuse the Ellsworths directly, and yet, townsfolk whispered that the family demanded these offerings to keep the curse from spreading further. The orchard grew wilder, its trees twisted and blackened. Locals stopped calling it the Ellsworth Orchard at all. They called it the Widow's Field. The Ellsworth estate survived every disaster. Floods, fires, plagues, none touched it. But its halls were never quiet. Visitors spoke of cold drafts, of mirrors that distorted faces, of shadows that lingered after people had left the room. One Civil War soldier, billeted in Hartford, wrote a letter describing his stay at the estate. It was as if the walls themselves whispered, "I awoke to find the imprint of a woman's body beside me in the bed, though I slept alone. The pillow smelled of almonds." By the end of the century, the house was abandoned. Yet it was never torn down. Those who tried claimed their tools broke or that accidents befell them. The house resisted, as if Eleanor herself held it together, waiting. Margaret Ellsworth lived to a staggering age, her face withered but her eyes sharp to the end. She outlived her children, her grandchildren, and most of the town itself. In her final days, she was said to wander the orchard, whispering to the earth as though it answered her. When she finally died in 1897, her funeral was private. No grave marker was set. Some claim her body was never buried at all, but interred in the cellar of the Ellsworth estate, placed directly above the spot where Eleanor's blood had once stained the floor. Her last recorded words to the physician who attended her were stark. "Do not lose her. The town is hers if she rises." Today, Hartford speaks little of 1841. The Ellsworth estate stands empty, its shutters rotting, its orchard a blackened scar on the land. Local historians call Eleanor Whitcombe's death an unfortunate accident, nothing more. But the stories persist. Those who dare to trespass at night report the same. The faint music of a wedding march, played on no instrument. A woman in white glimpsed at the edge of vision. And the unbearable scent of bitter almonds, clinging to the air. The truth is scattered in fragments. Diaries, burned letters, whispers and archives no one opens. Yet one thread runs through them all. Eleanor was not only poisoned. She was bound to guard a family, a church, and a town that traded her life for power. And some believe she is not finished. That beneath Hartford's soil, the bride still waits. Not resting, not forgiven, watching,